Emma Carter checked her reflection in the restaurant's bathroom mirror for the third time in 10 minutes. Her hands were shaking, but not from the cold outside. Tonight was different. Tonight, for the first time in almost 2 years, she had a real date. Her co-worker Danielle had set it up. "He's sweet, he's stable, and he actually wants a future," Danielle had said, practically shoving Emma's phone number into some guy's hands during a catering event. Emma had laughed it off at first. Blind dates never worked out for her. But it was Christmas Eve. The restaurant was glowing with string lights and pine garlands, and for once, she let herself hope. She smoothed down her green wrap dress, the one that made her feel confident instead of self-conscious, and walked out to the hostess stand where she was supposed to meet him. His name was Marcus. He was already seated at a table near the window, scrolling through his phone. Emma recognized him from the photo Danielle had shown her. She walked over, smiling, her heart pounding with nervous excitement.
"Marcus? Hi, I'm Emma."
He looked up. His eyes moved over her, slow and obvious, and his smile disappeared. "Wait." He actually laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're Emma?" The photo Danielle sent me looked different. Emma's stomach dropped.
"It's the same photo I use for everything."
"Look, no offense, but this isn't what I signed up for." He stood, grabbing his jacket off the back of the chair. "I pictured someone smaller. I'm sorry, I can't do this." The restaurant had gone quiet around them. Emma felt her face burning as every eye in the dining room turned toward her table. Marcus didn't even bother lowering his voice. He walked straight past the hostess stand, and outside, waiting under the awning, was a woman in a red coat. He greeted her with a hug like the whole thing had been planned. Emma stood frozen by the empty table, humiliation crawling up her neck. Somewhere behind her, a phone was recording. She heard the faint click of a camera shutter disguised as candid conversation. By the time she made it back to the kitchen, her hands were trembling so badly she dropped a tray of wine glasses. She didn't know it yet, but that video would be online by morning. By New Year's, half the city would have seen it. In the restaurant's private dining room, separated from the main floor by a pair of heavy oak doors, 28-year-old Ethan Sullivan sat at the head of a long table surrounded by attorneys and family advisors. To the world, Ethan was the CEO of Sullivan Hospitality Group, one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the country. Within a much smaller circle, he was known as something else entirely, the quiet, controlled head of an organization that few dared to name out loud. Tonight's dinner was supposed to be simple: contracts to review, end-of-year numbers to finalize. Instead, his lead attorney, a sharp woman named Rachel Voss, slid a folder across the table with a look Ethan hadn't seen on her face before. "You need to see this before the holiday," Rachel said. "It came in an hour ago." Ethan opened the folder. His jaw tightened. Financial records. Fresh, notarized, filed with the state. His wife's signature, Olivia Sullivan, declared legally dead 3 years ago after her yacht vanished during a storm off the coast of Maine. No body was ever found, but after 2 years of searching, the courts had finally closed the case. Now her name was back, attached to wire transfers, attached to changes in 3 separate Sullivan-owned holding companies. "She's alive?" Ethan asked, though the words barely came out. "We don't know," Rachel said carefully. "What we know is that someone used her identity, and it's legally valid enough to freeze several of your agreements until the courts determine your marital status. Until this is resolved, contracts under joint ownership are locked. Vendors are already asking questions." Ethan sat back, his mind spinning through implications faster than emotions. 3 years of grief shelved the moment business was threatened. He needed this resolved, fast, quietly. He barely heard the rest of the meeting. When it ended, he walked out through the main dining room to clear his head, past tables of couples and families laughing over dessert. That's when he saw her, the waitress from before. Standing near the kitchen doors, spine straight, chin lifted, refilling water glasses like nothing had happened, even though he could see her hands were still unsteady. Something about the way she held herself, wounded but refusing to fall apart in front of strangers, made him stop walking. He'd seen boardrooms full of powerful people crumble under far less pressure than what he'd just watched her survive in front of an entire restaurant. Ethan approached the table where she was clearing dishes. "Excuse me," he said. Emma turned, startled. "Sir, if you need anything, I can get your server." "I don't need anything from the menu." He studied her for a moment, an idea forming that even he knew sounded insane. "I need to ask you something. It's going to sound completely absurd." Emma blinked at him, still rattled, in no mood for jokes. "Okay." Ethan lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Would you consider becoming my wife?" Emma actually laughed, assuming it was some kind of cruel Christmas prank, a second humiliation stacked on the first. "Right. Very funny. Merry Christmas to you too." She turned to walk away. "I'm serious," Ethan said. Something in his voice made her stop. Emma turned back around slowly, half expecting to see a camera crew jump out and tell her this was some kind of prank show, but the man's face stayed still. No smirk, no cameras, just quiet, tired eyes that looked like they hadn't slept properly in years. "You don't even know my name," she said. "Emma Carter." He said it without hesitation. "Your name tag." She looked down at her chest, embarrassed she'd forgotten something so obvious was pinned right there. "Okay, well, Emma Carter is going to go back to work now, because I've had a very long night." "Take my card," Ethan said, sliding a plain black card across the tray in her hands. No logo, just a phone number. "If you change your mind about hearing me out, call before New Year's. After that, the offer won't matter anymore." He left before she could respond, and Emma stood there holding the card like it might bite her. She didn't call that night, or the next day. By the following morning, the video was everywhere. Someone had posted the blind date clip with the caption, "When he realizes she's not the photo," and it had already crossed 200,000 views before Emma even woke up. Comments piled in, some cruel, some defending her, all of it suffocating. Her phone buzzed non-stop. Co-workers she barely spoke to were suddenly texting her links like she hadn't already seen it 100 times. The restaurant manager called her in for a quiet conversation 2 days later. He didn't fire her, but he suggested she take some time off until the attention dies down. Customers had started coming in just to see if they'd spot her. It wasn't safe for her, he said, or good for business. Either way, Emma found herself standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant with a box of her things and no income for the first time in 6 years. That night, sitting alone in her Brooklyn apartment with the heat barely working, she pulled the black card out of her coat pocket and stared at it for a long time before finally dialing the number. Ethan picked up on the second ring, like he'd been waiting. "I'll listen," Emma said. "That's all I'm agreeing to." They met the next afternoon at a law office in Manhattan, all glass walls and quiet efficiency. Rachel Voss sat across from Emma with a folder of documents, while Ethan stood near the window, arms crossed, letting his attorney do the explaining. "Mr. Sullivan's legal situation is complicated," Rachel said. "His wife was declared dead 3 years ago. Recently, someone has used her identity in ways that put several of his business agreements at risk. Remarrying before certain court deadlines would create legal separation between his current holdings and whatever is happening with his previous marriage. It protects the business while investigators sort out what's actually going on." Emma looked between the two of them, still not fully processing it. "So you want to marry a stranger for paperwork?" "Essentially," Ethan said. "No pretending we're in love, no expectations beyond a legal partnership. You'd keep your own life, your own career, whatever that looks like going forward. In exchange, I'll make sure your name is no longer associated with public humiliation, and I'll compensate you well beyond that." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple, but it's honest." He finally looked at her directly. "I'm not going to pretend this is romantic, Emma. I'm asking because you handled something painful in front of strangers without falling apart, and I need someone steady right now. That's the whole reason." Emma sat with that for a long moment. 6 years working double shifts to keep an apartment she could barely afford. A humiliating video with her name attached that would follow her for months. No family to fall back on since her mother passed 2 winters ago. Nothing waiting for her except more of the same exhausting cycle. "I need boundaries," she finally said. "Real ones, not just words in a contract." "Name them." "I keep working, once this dies down. Somewhere that isn't connected to you if I want. I'm not expected to attend every event or play a role I didn't agree to. And if either of us wants out eventually, there's a way out that doesn't leave me with nothing." Ethan nodded slowly. Rachel will draft exactly that. Emma exhaled, unsure if she was making the best decision of her life, or the worst one.
"Then I suppose I'm getting married."
The wedding happened 4 days after Christmas, in a small civil ceremony inside the same law office, with Rachel and 1 witness from Ethan's staff standing in as the only guests. Emma wore a simple ivory dress she'd bought that morning. Nothing extravagant, nothing that pretended to be more than what this was. Ethan slid a plain gold band onto her finger. His hand was steady. Hers wasn't. "Mrs. Sullivan," the officiant said, and the words landed strange in the quiet room, like they belonged to someone else's life. Neither of them smiled the way people were supposed to smile at their own wedding. But as they walked out of the office into the cold afternoon light, Emma caught Ethan glancing at her once, like he was trying to figure out exactly what he'd just done. Neither of them expected it would ever become anything more than paperwork. The Sullivan estate sat on 12 acres of Connecticut countryside, half hidden behind a stone wall and rows of bare winter trees. Emma had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Walking through the estate's front doors for the first time, carrying 1 suitcase and a box of kitchen supplies she probably wouldn't need, she felt like she'd wandered onto a movie set. A housekeeper named Marta showed her to a wing on the 2nd floor, separate from Ethan's rooms, exactly as they'd agreed. The space was beautiful and enormous and completely silent, the kind of silence that made every footstep echo. Dinner that first night was where Emma met the rest of the family, and where she understood exactly how complicated her new life had become. Ethan's aunt, Carol, greeted her warmly enough, asking about her background, her family, nodding along like she was genuinely interested. His cousin Richard barely looked up from his plate, and his uncle Paul made a comment halfway through the meal that landed like a slap. "Married awfully fast, didn't he?" Paul said, not quite to Emma, not quite to the table. "Olivia's barely cold in the ground, so to speak, and he's already replacing her." "Paul," Carol snapped. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Emma kept her eyes on her plate, cheeks burning, while Ethan said nothing, jaw tight, letting the silence answer for him. Later, walking her back toward the staircase, he offered something close to an apology. "Ignore him, he's always been difficult." "It's fine," Emma said, though it wasn't, not really. Over the following days, she noticed things, small things at first, that she chalked up to old habits in a house that had once belonged to 2 people. Then they started to feel less like habits and more like something else entirely. There was a bedroom at the far end of the west wing that Marta always walked past without opening. Emma asked about it once, casually, and Marta's expression shifted just slightly. "That was Mrs. Sullivan's room, Olivia's. Does anyone use it now?" Marta hesitated. "No one's supposed to." Emma let it go, but curiosity pulled at her anyway. A few days later, passing that same hallway, she noticed the door slightly open, and inside, fresh white flowers sitting in a vase on the dresser. Not artificial, real, recently cut, the kind that needed replacing every few days. She mentioned it to Ethan over breakfast, careful with her tone. "There are flowers in Olivia's room, fresh ones." Something flickered across his face, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "The staff keeps the room maintained. Force of habit, probably." "Whose habit?" He didn't answer that, and Emma didn't push, though the unease sat with her the rest of the day. Nobody in that house seemed willing to explain who was ordering flowers for a woman who'd been declared dead for 3 years. If the estate felt like walking through a minefield, the Sullivan Hospitality headquarters felt like the opposite. Emma started spending a few days a week there, partly out of boredom, partly because Ethan had mentioned he needed a fresh set of eyes on guest complaints piling up across several properties. Her first afternoon in the executive offices, she sat in on a meeting where senior managers argued over declining satisfaction scores at 3 hotels, throwing around numbers and marketing strategies that all sounded like guesses dressed up as solutions. Emma, who had spent 6 years actually working the floor of a restaurant, listened for 20 minutes before speaking up. Has anyone actually read the complaints themselves? Not the summaries, the actual guest comments. The room went quiet. One of the directors, a woman named Priya, slid a stack of printed reviews across the table, half amused, half testing her. Emma read through a dozen of them out loud. Slow checkout times, housekeeping staff being treated poorly by front desk managers, which trickled down into worse service overall. Guests noticing tension between staff, even if they couldn't name what it was. "It's not the rooms," Emma said. "It's morale. Your staff are miserable, and guests can feel it even when they can't explain why." Priya studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "That's actually the first useful thing said in this meeting." Word spread quickly after that. Within 2 weeks, Emma had earned a strange kind of respect around the office, not because of her last name, but because she treated the housekeeping staff with the same warmth she gave the executives, remembered people's names, and never once acted like she belonged there more than anyone else. Ethan noticed too. He started finding reasons to walk by whatever floor she was working on, staying longer than necessary in conversations that had nothing to do with hotel operations. One evening, after Emma successfully talked down a furious guest in the lobby of the flagship property without involving security, Ethan found her by the coffee station, laughing quietly to herself. "You're good at this," he said. "I've dealt with worse than an angry guest over a room upgrade." He smiled, actually smiled, something Emma realized she hadn't seen from him since the day they met. "I haven't done that in a while." "Done what?" Smiled, like I meant it. Emma didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But something between them had shifted, quiet and unspoken, growing in the space where suspicion and grief used to sit. Neither of them mentioned the flowers again. But Emma kept thinking about that closed door and the fresh vase inside it, wondering who in that enormous house was keeping a dead woman's room alive. 3 weeks into the marriage, Rachel Voss asked Emma for a favor that had nothing to do with hotels or guest complaints. "We're drowning in paperwork trying to trace these fraudulent transfers," Rachel said, dropping a thick binder on the conference table at the Boston property. "Legal's stretched thin. You've got a good eye for detail. Would you mind going through some of the older archived documents while we handle the newer filings?" Emma agreed before she fully thought it through, mostly because she wanted an excuse to understand what was actually happening, instead of picking up fragments from Ethan's tense phone calls and the family's whispered comments at dinner. She spent 2 days in a windowless records room beneath the Boston headquarters, sorting through years of notarized documents, wire transfer approvals, and signature verifications. Most of it meant nothing to her. Legal language blurred together after the 4th hour. Then she started noticing something odd. Every document bearing Olivia's signature followed a nearly identical format. The signature itself looked flawless, matched perfectly against older samples Rachel had provided for comparison. Even the handwriting in supplementary notes matched. Whoever was producing these documents had clearly studied Olivia extensively, down to small habits like how she crossed her 7s or looped her lowercase g's. But the dates were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being inaccurate, wrong in style. Older documents, ones Emma confirmed were genuinely signed by Olivia years earlier, always wrote dates a specific way. Day, then month, spelled out. European style. something Emma later learned Olivia had picked up from boarding school overseas. The recent fraudulent documents wrote dates the standard American way, month first. It was such a small thing. Anyone glancing through hundreds of pages would miss it entirely, but once Emma noticed the pattern, she couldn't unsee it. Every single fraudulent document, going back over a year, made the exact same mistake. She brought the binder to Rachel's office that evening, spreading the pages out across the desk.
Whoever's doing this knew Olivia well enough to copy her handwriting almost perfectly, Emma said, but not well enough to know how she wrote dates. That's not a stranger forging documents. That's someone close to her, working from memory, filling in details they don't fully have. Rachel stared at the pages for a long moment, then looked up at Emma with something close to respect. Nobody on my team caught that. We've had this binder for 2 weeks. I had fresh eyes and too much free time, Emma said, though privately, she felt a small spark of pride she hadn't expected. Ethan came by the office as Rachel was photographing the pages for the legal file. He listened to Emma explain the pattern, quiet and focused, the way he got whenever something mattered. So we're not just looking for someone who stole her identity, he said slowly. We're looking for someone who knew her personally, close enough to study her handwriting for years. That's a much shorter list, Rachel added. Nobody said it out loud, but Emma could see the same uneasy thought settling over both of them. The list of people who knew Olivia intimately enough to fake her that convincingly wasn't long, and most of the names on it belonged to the family Emma now technically shared a last name with. The following weekend, Ethan took Emma to check on renovations at a smaller Sullivan property near a marina in Rhode Island, partly business, partly an excuse to get away from the estate's suffocating tension. They walked along the docks afterward, the cold air biting, but clearing Emma's head in a way the mansion never did. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said. "About Olivia." Ethan's shoulders tensed slightly, but he nodded. "Was she close with your family? Really close, I mean? Someone who spent years around her, learned her habits?" Everyone was close with her, in some way. She had that effect on people. He paused, staring out at the water. Why?
Emma told him about the marina employee she'd noticed earlier that morning, mentioning, almost in passing, that a woman matching a vague description had checked into their sister property nearby twice in the past month, always paying cash, always leaving before staff could get a clear look at her face. Security flagged it because she wore sunglasses indoors both times, kept her head down around cameras, Emma said. I only heard about it because Priya mentioned it while I was reviewing complaint logs. Nobody thought much of it until now. Ethan's face went pale in the fading afternoon light. Description? Tall, blonde, similar build to the pictures I've seen of Olivia. He didn't respond right away, staring out at the gray water like he was trying to piece something together that refused to fit. Finally, he said, quiet and careful, "Get the footage. All of it."
"I want to see her face." They drove back to the property in silence, tension thick between them, both turning the same unsettling thought over without saying it aloud. If someone was skilled enough to forge documents this convincingly, and a woman matching Olivia's description kept appearing and vanishing without explanation, the mystery Emma had assumed was simple financial fraud was clearly something far more complicated. By the time they reached the hotel, security had already pulled the footage. The woman's face was angled away from every camera, sunglasses hiding whatever expression she wore, but something about the way she moved, unhurried, confident, familiar with the property's layout, made the hair on Emma's arms stand up. "That's not a random employee's guess," Emma said quietly. "Whoever that is, she knows exactly where she's going." For a while, the investigation slowed to a crawl. Rachel's team traced the mystery woman's cash payments to dead ends, fake names that led nowhere, and the strange visits stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Life at the estate settled into something almost normal, or as normal as Emma's life had gotten since Christmas Eve. She and Ethan started attending events together, not because the contract required it, but because it made sense given everything happening with the business. A charity gala in Vermont raising money for a hospital, a hotel opening in New York with press cameras lined up outside, a weekend trip to check on a winter lodge property tucked into the mountains, where they ended up snowed in for an extra night neither of them minded. Something shifted during those weeks, slow and quiet, the kind of change neither of them could point to a single moment for. At the Vermont gala, Emma noticed Ethan speaking to the catering staff differently than she'd seen him speak to anyone in a boardroom, asking about their families, remembering names from previous events. When she mentioned it later, he shrugged like it was nothing. "You started that, actually," he said. "I used to walk past staff without really seeing them. You made me pay attention." At the New York opening, Ethan pulled Emma aside from the crowd of reporters and executives to show her something in the hotel's unfinished restaurant space, a rough sketch pinned to the wall. "I told the design team to leave room for a dessert counter," he said. "Figured you'd have opinions." Emma stared at him, surprised. She'd mentioned once, in passing, an old dream of creating a dessert menu, something she'd never pursued because culinary school wasn't in the budget for a waitress supporting herself alone. She hadn't expected him to remember, let alone act on it. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." Their conversation stopped feeling like careful negotiations between strangers and started feeling like something else entirely. Emma caught herself laughing at his dry humor more often, staying up late talking with him in the estate's kitchen instead of retreating to her wing the moment dinner ended. Ethan started finding reasons to linger near wherever she was working, the same way he had back at headquarters weeks earlier. Snowed into the winter lodge one evening, sitting by the fireplace, with mugs of coffee neither of them had touched, Ethan finally said what they'd both been avoiding. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "What wasn't?" "This. Whatever this is." He looked at her, something open and unguarded in his expression that she hadn't seen before. "I married you to solve a legal problem, Emma. I didn't expect to actually look forward to seeing you." Emma's heart pounded, the kind of nervous, hopeful feeling she'd assumed she'd lost the ability to feel after Marcus walked out on Christmas Eve. "I didn't expect that either." Neither of them kissed the other that night, but something had been said out loud that couldn't be unsaid, and Emma drove back to the estate the next morning with a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in years. The lightness didn't last. 2 days later, Rachel called an emergency meeting at the estate, her expression tight as she set a tablet on the table in front of Ethan and Emma. "Security caught something at the Manhattan property last night," she said. "I need you both to see this before it leaks somewhere else." The footage showed a woman entering through a service corridor around midnight, moving with the same unhurried confidence as before. This time, the camera angle caught a partial glimpse of her face before she disappeared from frame, just enough to make the resemblance to Olivia unmistakable. The room went silent. "She was here," Ethan said quietly. "Days ago, not months, days." Word spread through the family faster than Rachel could contain it. By dinner that evening, Uncle Paul was practically shouting at the table, red-faced and furious. "She's alive, and you're sitting here playing house with someone else," he said, jabbing a finger toward Emma without quite looking at her. "This marriage was supposed to be temporary paperwork. If Olivia's alive, this entire thing is a legal disaster, and frankly, it looks suspicious that certain people are so eager to keep the current arrangement going." "That's enough," Ethan said, sharp enough that Paul actually sat back, but the damage had already landed. Emma sat frozen through the rest of dinner, Paul's accusation ringing in her ears, feeling every set of eyes at the table shift toward her like she'd done something wrong simply by being there. Later that night, alone in her room, Emma stared at the ceiling, replaying the last few weeks. The dessert counter sketch, the fireplace conversation, the way Ethan looked at her lately. Nothing like the cold, business-like stranger who'd proposed a legal arrangement in a restaurant on Christmas Eve. None of it mattered if Olivia was still out there. Emma had let herself fall for a man whose real wife might still be alive, and no matter how genuine the last few weeks had felt, she couldn't shake the fear that she'd built something real on top of a foundation that was never actually hers to build on. By morning, she'd convinced herself of one thing.
She needed to know the truth, whatever it cost her, before she let herself fall any further into a life that might not belong to her at all. The estate stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like a courtroom. Every conversation at dinner turned into an argument about Olivia, about the footage, about what should happen next. Emma sat through most of it in silence, watching a family she'd only just started to understand pull itself apart from the inside. They gathered at the family's cabin outside Boston for what was supposed to be a quiet planning session with Rachel and 2 investigators. It became something closer to a battlefield within the first 20 minutes. "If she's alive, she needs to come forward properly," Cousin Richard said, pacing near the fireplace. "Publicly, legally. This hiding and sneaking around cameras is making all of us look complicit in something." "She's clearly avoiding something, or someone," Carol said. "Has anyone considered she might be in danger? That she's not the one committing fraud, but the one running from whoever is. Or she's exactly who's behind it," Paul cut in, "and everyone at this table is too sentimental to consider it." Emma listened to them circle the same argument for the 3rd time that week, always ending in the same place, always focused entirely on Olivia. Was she alive? Was she dangerous? Was she a victim? Nobody, Emma noticed, was asking the question that seemed most obvious to her. She waited until the room quieted, everyone exhausted from repeating themselves, before speaking up. "Can I ask something that isn't about Olivia?" The room turned toward her, mildly surprised she'd spoken at all. "Everyone keeps asking whether she's alive, whether she's guilty, whether she's dangerous. But nobody's asked why. If someone wanted to steal money using her identity, why keep doing it in a way this traceable? Every transfer left a paper trail. Every visit got caught on camera eventually."
That's not how someone hides theft. That's careless. Or it's not theft at all. Rachel, who'd been quiet through most of the shouting, straightened in her chair. "She has a point. I've been so focused on identifying who's behind this that I never actually mapped out where the money went." "I can help with that," Emma offered. "I've already spent 2 weeks buried in your archives. Give me another day." She spent the next day back in the records room, this time with Rachel beside her, tracing every fraudulent transfer to its final destination instead of just its point of origin. What they found didn't match anything the family had assumed. The money hadn't disappeared into a private account. It hadn't funded a lavish new life somewhere overseas. Every single transfer, going back over a year, had been redirected into struggling Sullivan-owned properties. 3 smaller hotels the family barely discussed anymore, all of them buried in the company's least profitable division. Emma pulled up the financial records for each property. All 3 had been on the edge of bankruptcy 18 months ago. Layoffs were drafted, contracts prepared to sell the buildings off entirely. Then, mysteriously, each property had quietly stabilized, payroll met, vendors paid, renovations funded just enough to keep operating. "These are the properties in Maine, Vermont, and upstate New York," Rachel said slowly, cross-referencing the paperwork. "The ones we almost sold last year." "Someone kept them alive," Emma said. "Whoever's been using Olivia's identity wasn't stealing from the company. They were quietly funneling money into it, into the parts nobody else was paying attention to." Ethan arrived partway through their discovery, drawn in by Rachel's urgent phone call. He stood over the spread of documents, silent for a long moment as the pieces settled into place. "Why hide it then?" he said finally. "If someone's saving the business, why not just come to me directly?" Nobody had an answer for that yet, but the question changed everything. Emma watched something shift in Ethan's expression, the anger and suspicion from the past week softening into something closer to confusion, maybe even guilt. "There were people at those 3 properties," Emma said carefully. "Real families, hundreds of jobs on the line. Whoever did this wasn't trying to become rich. They were trying to protect people your family had already written off." The family meeting that evening looked different from every one before it. Paul, who'd spent the week convinced Olivia was orchestrating some kind of theft, sat quietly through Rachel's presentation, his earlier certainty visibly cracking. Richard, who demanded a public confrontation, went unusually still. "So we've spent weeks accusing her of stealing from us," Carol said softly, "when she might have been the only one actually paying attention to what was happening at the bottom of this company." Ethan said little through the rest of the meeting, but Emma noticed him staring at the folder of financial records long after everyone else had gone quiet, like a man realizing he'd misjudged something important for far too long. Later that night, he found Emma alone in the estate's kitchen, the same spot where their careful arrangement had first started turning into something real. "You were right," he said, "about the dates, about the money, about all of it." "I just followed the paperwork." "No," he shook his head slowly. "Everyone else in that family spent weeks assuming the worst about someone they used to love, myself included. You were the only one who stopped and asked why. That matters, Emma, more than you realize." Emma didn't have a response for that, but something about the way he said it settled the unease she'd been carrying since the footage first surfaced. Whatever was happening with Olivia, whoever she'd become, one thing had become clear. This had never been a simple story about betrayal. It was about to become something far more complicated and far more human than anyone at that table had expected. The final lead came from an old business associate of Olivia's, a woman named Grace, who used to manage bookings at one of the smaller Sullivan properties years earlier. Rachel tracked her down through payroll records, and after a hesitant phone call, Grace agreed to meet, though only in person, and only somewhere far from the family's usual circles. She named a small coastal bookstore on Martha's Vineyard. Ethan and Emma took the ferry out together on a gray Tuesday morning, the water choppy and cold beneath them. Neither spoke much during the crossing. Emma could feel the tension radiating off him. 3 years of grief and confusion narrowing down to whatever answer waited on the other side of that water. The bookstore sat at the end of a quiet street, bell chiming softly above the door as they walked in. Grace was waiting near the back, an older woman with kind eyes and nervous hands, clearly uncomfortable with whatever conversation was about to happen. "She said you'd come eventually," Grace said quietly. "She's been expecting it." "She's here?" Ethan asked, voice tight. Grace nodded toward a narrow staircase leading to an apartment above the shop. "She rents the space upstairs, has for a while now." Ethan climbed the stairs first, Emma close behind, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully untangle. He knocked once, and the door opened before his hand fully lowered. Olivia stood in the doorway. She looked different from the photographs Emma had seen scattered around the estate, thinner, her hair cut shorter, dressed simply in a wool sweater instead of the polished designer clothes from old company events. But there was no mistaking her. Alive. Healthy. Very clearly the woman everyone had spent 3 years believing was dead. "Ethan," she said softly. For a long moment, nobody moved. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, staring at a wife he'd buried in every sense except the literal one, while Emma stood slightly behind him, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a moment that belonged to someone else's life. "You should sit down," Olivia said finally. "Both of you. This is going to take a while to explain." They sat around a small kitchen table while Olivia made tea nobody touched, her hands steady despite the enormity of the conversation ahead of her. "I found something I wasn't supposed to find," she began. "About 2 years before the accident, our financial advisor Gordon had been quietly manipulating records across several smaller properties, moving numbers around in ways that looked legitimate on paper, but were slowly bleeding those hotels dry. I brought it to your father first, since you were still learning the business side back then." "He never told me any of this," Ethan said. "He didn't believe me at first, and by the time he started looking into it seriously, he passed before he could act on what I'd shown him. Gordon had years to build trust with your family. I had suspicion and a handful of documents that didn't prove much on their own." She explained the rest carefully, methodically, like she'd rehearsed this exact conversation 100 times in her head, waiting for the day someone would finally ask. The boat accident had been real, A genuine storm that nearly took her life. But afterward, floating in freezing water with nothing but the clothes she'd been wearing, Olivia realized something with startling clarity. Nobody would believe a grieving widow's accusations against a trusted family advisor. But a woman legally declared dead could move quietly, gather proof without anyone watching her, without Gordon suspecting a thing. She used contacts from her old life carefully, staying just far enough removed to remain hidden, spending years slowly documenting every manipulated account, every falsified record. The recent transfers into the struggling properties had been her, using skills she'd learned from studying the company's books for a decade, protecting the employees at those hotels the same way she'd tried to protect the whole business years earlier. "I never wanted to steal anything," Olivia said. "I wanted proof strong enough that nobody could dismiss it again. And I wanted those 3 properties to survive long enough for that proof to matter." "The mystery woman on the security footage," Emma said quietly. "That was you, checking on the properties." Olivia nodded. "I got careless near the end. I needed physical documents from company archives that weren't digitized, records only accessible on site. I knew the cameras would eventually catch something clear enough to recognize." Ethan sat back, processing years of grief reorganizing itself into something entirely different. 3 years, Olivia. 3 years I thought you were dead." "I know." Her voice cracked slightly, the first break in her composure since they'd arrived. "I'm not asking you to forgive that easily. I made a choice, and it cost you something real. But I couldn't think of another way to get close enough to Gordon's records without him realizing I was still watching." Emma sat quietly through the rest of the conversation, watching Ethan absorb an entirely new version of the wife he'd mourned. Not a victim of tragedy, but a woman who'd sacrificed her own life, her own name, her own relationships, to protect people who never knew they needed protecting. "What happens now?" Emma finally asked. Olivia looked between them, something knowing in her expression, like she'd already understood the answer before Emma had finished asking. "Now," Olivia said, "we finish what I started. Gordon needs to be exposed properly, with real evidence, in a way the whole family can't ignore or dismiss. And then..." She paused, glancing briefly at the space between Ethan and Emma, the careful distance they'd unconsciously kept even sitting at the same table. "Then I think it's time I figure out what my life actually looks like now, separate from all of this." Nobody said much on the ferry ride back. Ethan stared out at the water, quiet and overwhelmed, while Emma sat beside him, unsure whether the woman she'd just met was a threat to everything she'd started building, or the key to finally putting it all back together the right way. Back in New York, the family gathered again, but this time the mood in the room was different. No shouting, no accusations, just quiet disbelief as Rachel laid out everything Olivia had spent years documenting, alongside the paperwork Emma had already uncovered in the archives. "Gordon Whitfield," Rachel said, sliding a photo across the table. An older man in a tailored suit who'd sat at nearly every family gathering for the past decade, trusted enough to manage accounts worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. "He's been quietly restructuring payments across a dozen properties since before Olivia's accident, skimming margins here, inflating maintenance costs there, small enough each time to avoid raising flags, but consistent enough over 10 years to add up to millions." Carol pressed a hand to her mouth. Richard sat frozen, staring at the photo like he was seeing a stranger for the first time. Even Paul, who rarely admitted fault in anything, looked genuinely shaken. "He was at Thanksgiving," Carol said quietly. "Every year." Olivia, sitting at the far end of the table for the first time in 3 years, spoke calmly, despite the weight of the moment. "He's good at being trusted. That's exactly why it took this long to catch him." Over the following 2 weeks, Rachel's team worked with investigators to build a case strong enough to hold up without dragging the family's name through a public scandal. Olivia's documentation, combined with Emma's discovery of the formatting inconsistencies, gave them everything needed. Gordon was confronted quietly in a private meeting,
presented with evidence too thorough to argue against, and removed from his position immediately. He resigned rather than face a drawn-out legal battle, quietly returning what funds could be recovered in exchange for the matter staying out of the press. No dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle, just a slow, careful unraveling of a decade-long betrayal, handled the same methodical way Olivia had built her case in the first place. With Gordon gone, the family's finances stabilized faster than anyone expected.
The 3 struggling properties, the ones Olivia had quietly kept afloat, were reassessed with proper oversight for the first time in years and began turning modest profits within a month. Employees who'd spent years bracing for layoffs finally exhaled. Olivia's legal situation resolved almost as quickly, with clear evidence that she'd never stolen anything, that every questionable transfer had a documented, legitimate purpose behind it. The courts moved swiftly to clear her name and update her legal status from deceased to alive, a strange and surreal piece of paperwork that made even the judge pause before signing it. She met with Emma one final time before leaving, at a quiet cafe a few blocks from the Manhattan headquarters. "I owe you something," Olivia said, wrapping her hands around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "You're the reason this got resolved as cleanly as it did. If you hadn't caught those dates, if you hadn't traced the money instead of chasing rumors like everyone else, Gordon could have kept going for years." "I just noticed a pattern," Emma said. "You did the actual work, years of it." "Maybe." Olivia studied her for a moment, something gentle in her expression. "Can I tell you something else? Something that has nothing to do with Gordon?" Emma nodded. "When I disappeared, I told myself I was protecting the company, protecting the people at those hotels. All true, but somewhere along the way, I think I was also protecting myself from a marriage that had already gone quiet long before that storm. Ethan and I loved each other once, but we'd become 2 people managing a business together, not 2 people building a life. I didn't realize how much until I watched him with you these past few weeks." Emma's throat tightened. "Olivia, you don't have to say this." "I want to." She smiled, small and genuine. "He's different with you. Lighter. I saw it the moment I watched the 2 of you on that ferry, even in the middle of everything falling apart. That's not something I ever saw in the years before I left." She reached across the table, squeezing Emma's hand briefly. "Thank you for giving him that back. I mean it." Olivia left the following week, choosing to formally finalize the divorce that had technically never been completed given the circumstances of her legal death, and moving forward with a quiet, private life far from the Sullivan name, funded modestly by a settlement she'd insisted be smaller than what the lawyers recommended. "I don't need the money," she told Rachel. "I just need my name to finally be mine again." Emma stood in the estate's kitchen the evening after Olivia's papers were finalized, staring out at the dark winter garden, turning over everything that had happened since a stranger asked her an impossible question in a restaurant on Christmas Eve. She'd assumed for weeks that whatever she felt for Ethan existed only because Olivia was gone, a kind of accidental placeholder filling space left behind by someone else's absence. Ethan found her there, leaning against the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I keep thinking about something Olivia said before she left," he said. "That watching you work through this whole mess reminded her why she fell in love with the version of me that existed before the business swallowed everything else." "That must have been hard to hear." "It wasn't, actually." He walked closer, quiet and certain. "Because she's right, Emma. I didn't fall for you because Olivia was gone. I fell for you because of who you are. The way you handled that video, the way you caught what an entire legal team missed, the way you treated hotel staff exactly the same as you treated me from the very first conversation. None of that had anything to do with her." Emma finally understood what she'd been too afraid to believe for weeks. This had never been about replacing someone. It had been about becoming someone new, together, built from nothing but honesty and the strange, unexpected proposal that started it all. A year moves faster than people expect when it's filled with actual purpose. By the following December, Emma was no longer the waitress from the viral video, a label that had followed her through those first painful weeks like a shadow she couldn't shake. Now, when people recognized her, it was usually for something else entirely. Her dessert collection, first tested in that half-finished restaurant space in Manhattan, had expanded into every Sullivan hospitality property across the country. A caramel apple tart she'd developed during a slow week at the estate had become the most requested dessert at 3 different hotel restaurants, something she still found strange to think about when she saw it listed on a menu with her name quietly credited beneath it. She'd also taken on a formal role, overseeing guest experience company-wide, a job that grew naturally out of the work she'd started almost by accident, reading through complaint logs nobody else wanted to touch. Priya, who'd once tested her with a stack of guest reviews just to see if she was serious, now reported directly to her. Ethan had changed too, though the shift in him was quieter, harder to point to on paper. He still ran the business with the same sharp instincts that had built it into what it was, but something had softened in how he ran it. Staff meetings started including voices from housekeeping and front desk teams, not just executives. Bonuses that used to disappear into upper management got restructured to reach the people actually running the properties day to day. The family's smaller hotels, the ones Olivia had quietly protected for years, were no longer treated as afterthoughts, buried in the least profitable division. They'd become, in Ethan's words, a reminder of what almost got lost. The other parts of his life had quieted as well. Uncle Paul, humbled by how wrong he'd been about nearly everything during those chaotic weeks, had softened considerably, even showing up early to help set up chairs for the family's Christmas gathering that year, something nobody could remember him ever doing before. Olivia sent a card every few months, brief and warm. Updates from a small town somewhere in Oregon, where she'd apparently started teaching part-time at a community college, using a name that belonged entirely to her now. Emma kept the card from that first Christmas in a drawer in her office, the plain black one with nothing but a phone number, a strange little artifact from the night her whole life turned sideways. The Manhattan restaurant looked exactly the same as it had a year earlier. String lights wrapped around the windows, pine garlands along the hostess stand, the same soft hum of conversation filling the dining room. Ethan had booked the entire space for a small gathering. Friends, senior staff, a handful of family members who'd earned their way back into Emma's good graces over the past 12 months. He led her, without explanation, to a table near the window. Emma recognized it immediately. The same table where Marcus had looked her over and walked out into the cold, where a stranger's phone had quietly recorded the worst moment of her year, where everything that followed had somehow, impossibly, started. "You brought me back here on purpose," she said, half laughing, half something closer to tears. "I did." Ethan pulled out her chair, waiting until she sat before taking the seat across from her, the same seat he'd occupied a year earlier when he first crossed the dining room to ask her an absurd question. "I wanted to stand in this exact spot and tell you something, in front of the people who matter, instead of quietly at home like I've been tempted to do for months." Around them, conversation continued, servers moving between tables, someone laughing near the bar, the restaurant fully unaware of what was happening at one small table by the window. But for Emma, the noise faded into the background the way it had the night everything changed. "The night I asked you to become my wife," Ethan said. "I told myself I was solving a legal problem. Contracts frozen, a business at risk, a wife who'd legally reappeared out of nowhere. I convinced myself it was purely practical, the kind of decision a person makes under pressure and explains away later." He reached across the table, taking her hand the way he had 100 times over the past year, though it still made her breath catch every time. "I had no idea I was actually meeting the woman who'd become the love of my life. Not the paperwork, not the arrangement. You. The way you handled that humiliation without letting it break you. The way you caught what my entire legal team missed. The way you walked into a family that doubted you and made half of them fall in love with you anyway, myself included." Emma felt her eyes sting. The good kind of ache, The kind she'd stopped believing existed after Marcus walked out of this exact restaurant 12 months earlier. "I spent so long thinking I didn't deserve a real proposal," she said quietly, "that I got a legal arrangement because that's all a chubby waitress from Brooklyn was ever going to get offered." "You were wrong about that from the very beginning," Ethan said. "You just hadn't met the right person yet to prove it." He didn't get down on one knee, didn't produce a ring since the plain gold band on her finger had never actually come off in a year. Instead, he simply held her hand across the table, steady and certain, while the restaurant hummed quietly around them, indifferent to the fact that the worst night of Emma Carter's life had somehow, impossibly, led her straight to the happiest one. Outside the window, snow began falling softly over Manhattan, exactly like it had a year earlier. Emma smiled, finally understanding that sometimes the story people write about you in whispers and viral videos has absolutely nothing to do with the one you end up living.